In the spring of 1958, a wealthy Manhattan real estate titan walked into an elegant Madison Avenue boutique, publicly humiliated two impeccably dressed black women with words so venomous that customers stood frozen in shame, and unknowingly set into motion a chain of events that would shake New York's financial and social elite to its core. It was 3:18 p.m. on Saturday, May 24, 1958, when Lillian Carter, 56, and her daughter-in-law Evelyn Carter, 32, stepped through the polished brass doors of Harrington and Blythe, an exclusive women's boutique on Madison Avenue that catered to old-money families and the wives of corporate executives who lunched at the St. Regis and summered in Newport. The store had recently begun, somewhat reluctantly, serving Negro customers after quiet pressure from shifting social attitudes, though many of its longtime patrons clearly resented the change. Lillian wore a tailored powder blue suit with white gloves and a modest pearl necklace, carrying a structured leather handbag that suggested refined taste rather than ostentation. Evelyn, poised and elegant, wore a cream silk dress fitted perfectly at the waist, her hat angled just so, her posture radiating calm assurance. They did not enter timidly. They entered as women accustomed to quality, browsing the displays of imported French silk gowns and hand-beaded evening wear with the quiet confidence of shoppers who intended to purchase, not merely admire. A young sales clerk approached and, though visibly nervous, asked politely if she could assist them. Lillian explained in a composed voice that they were looking for an evening gown suitable for a charity gala in Harlem the following month. For nearly 20 minutes, the visit proceeded without incident. They examined fabrics, asked about tailoring options, and discussed colors appropriate for late spring formal events. Several white customers glanced over with expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled disapproval, but no one spoke. That silence shattered at 3:41 p.m. when Charles Davenport III, 61, entered the boutique. Davenport was a Manhattan property magnate whose family had built its fortune in shipping and expanded into prime residential real estate. By 1958, he controlled more than a dozen buildings across Midtown and the Upper East Side, and sat on the boards of two financial institutions. Witnesses later described his demeanor that afternoon as instantly inflamed the moment he noticed two well-dressed black women examining gowns priced at $600 and above. According to statements gathered in the days that followed, Davenport's face flushed red as he strode across the showroom floor, his polished shoes striking sharply against the marble tiles, and without introduction or provocation, he demanded loudly to know what was going on here. The clerk attempted to interject, explaining that she was assisting customers, but Davenport cut her off, his voice rising enough to silence conversations across the room. He questioned how the women could possibly afford such garments, suggested that standards had declined at Harrington and Blythe, and declared that certain establishments were not meant to be social experiments. The language, while couched just enough to avoid explicit slurs in that first moment, carried unmistakable contempt. When Evelyn calmly replied that they were simply shopping, Davenport stepped closer, invading her space, and remarked that Madison Avenue was not Harlem, and that some people should remember where they belonged. Gasps rippled through the boutique. Lillian remained upright, chin slightly lifted, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, her composure unbroken, though witnesses noted a tightening around her eyes. Davenport then reached toward a gown Evelyn had been examining, a pale green French silk evening dress, and abruptly pulled it from her grasp, letting it fall to the floor as if contaminated. He told the manager, who had hurried from the back office, that merchandise handled under such circumstances should not be resold, and that he would personally compensate the store for its loss. He accused the women of using someone else's money, and implied that their presence was an embarrassment to respectable clientele. Several customers looked down at their shoes. One elderly woman reportedly whispered, "This is not proper," but no one intervened directly. The entire confrontation lasted approximately 5 to 7 minutes. Yet those present later described it as stretching far longer, each insult landing heavily in the hushed air of the showroom. Evelyn's composure faltered briefly. Her voice trembled as she asked Lillian if they should leave. Lillian gently took her arm and said, clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "We will not be reduced." Still, she guided her daughter-in-law toward the exit. Davenport followed several steps behind, continuing to speak loudly about tradition, standards, and what he called the natural order of things, until the manager physically positioned himself between Davenport and the women at the doorway. As Lillian and Evelyn stepped back onto Madison Avenue, sunlight reflecting off polished storefront windows, Davenport delivered one final remark that multiple witnesses later recounted almost verbatim. "Know your place." They did not respond. They walked steadily toward the corner, heads high, tears visible, but dignity intact. Inside the boutique, an uneasy silence lingered before subdued conversation resumed. What Davenport did not know, what not a single person in Harrington and Blythe could have guessed in that moment, was that Lillian Carter was the mother and Evelyn Carter the wife of Bumpy Johnson, a man whose influence in Harlem extended far beyond what polite Manhattan society understood, and that by 6 p.m. that same evening, the details of the confrontation would reach him in precise, unembellished terms. Nor did Davenport realize that in a city already shifting beneath the pressures of civil rights demands and changing economic alliances, humiliating the family of a man who valued respect above all else would not end at the boutique doors, but would instead mark the beginning of a response so calculated, so comprehensive, and so devastatingly strategic that within days members of New York's business elite would be whispering his name not with admiration, but with caution. By nightfall on Saturday, May 24, 1958, the insult delivered so casually on Madison Avenue had reached the one man in New York who could not be insulted without consequence. And what followed over the next 72 hours would unfold with such precision that even seasoned businessmen later admitted they never saw it coming. Lillian and Evelyn Carter arrived at a modest but well-guarded office above a bustling Lenox Avenue nightclub just after 5:10 p.m., both still visibly shaken despite their efforts to maintain composure during the ride uptown. According to William "Billy" Hart, a longtime associate who was present that evening, Evelyn tried initially to minimize what had happened, insisting it was merely an unpleasant scene. But Lillian quietly recounted the details in full. Charles Davenport III's raised voice, the insinuations about stolen money, the gown thrown to the floor, the words, "Know your place," spoken within earshot of a room full of silent onlookers. Throughout the account, Bumpy Johnson sat motionless behind his desk, fingertips pressed together, eyes steady and unreadable. Those familiar with him recognized that stillness not as indifference, but as calculation. He did not interrupt. He did not curse. He asked only one question when Lillian finished. Did anyone say his name? When told it was Charles Davenport III, the real estate developer with Midtown Holdings and Upper East Side properties, Johnson nodded once, slowly, and told the women to go home and rest, assuring them the matter would be handled. The tone, Hart later recalled, was calm enough to chill the room. By 6 p.m., Johnson had begun making calls, not to street enforcers, not to anyone who would attract police scrutiny, but to accountants, attorneys, community organizers, and business intermediaries who understood leverage in its most effective form. Within 2 hours, a full financial profile of Davenport's holdings was being assembled: 12 major residential buildings, 3 commercial properties, 2 development projects heavily financed through bank loans, and partnerships structured on thin liquidity margins that depended on continued confidence from lenders and investors. Johnson learned that Davenport operated with substantial leverage. His empire looked formidable from the outside, but relied on revolving credit and favorable loan terms to remain stable. By 9:30 p.m., quiet inquiries were already reaching loan officers at 2 institutions that had exposure to Davenport's projects. Inquiries framed not as threats, but as concerns, questions about risk assessment, about recent public conduct that might draw scrutiny in a city increasingly sensitive to racial controversy. Sunday morning brought a second wave of strategy. Johnson reached out to civic leaders in Harlem who had long documented discriminatory rental practices in several Davenport buildings. Tenant complaints about maintenance delays and selective leasing policies were compiled into organized reports. By noon, a respected attorney unaffiliated with Johnson formally requested documentation from the City Housing Authority regarding inspection histories tied to Davenport properties. Simultaneously, journalists from 2 local papers received tips that a prominent Manhattan developer had publicly berated black women at a Madison Avenue boutique, suggesting a pattern consistent with discriminatory leasing. The tips were factual, corroborated by witnesses, and carefully stripped of any reference to who had supplied the information. By late Sunday afternoon, one of Davenport's development partners, alerted discreetly that negative press might be imminent, began making calls of his own, worried about reputational spillover. Monday morning at 9 a.m., events accelerated. A small but orderly group of tenants gathered outside one of Davenport's largest properties on West 79th Street, distributing flyers that detailed maintenance grievances and called for equitable treatment in leasing. The demonstration was peaceful, legally permitted, and covered by a local reporter who happened to be nearby after receiving a weekend tip. At 11:15 a.m., one of Davenport's banks notified his office that certain covenants tied to his outstanding loans would be reviewed in light of emerging reputational considerations. The phrasing was clinical, the implication was not. By early afternoon, two prospective investors scheduled to finalize commitments in a midtown redevelopment postponed their meeting, citing concerns about public perception. Davenport, who had spent Sunday golfing in Westchester unaware of the machinery beginning to move against him, returned to Manhattan Monday evening to find his voicemail flooded and his attorney requesting an urgent conference. On Tuesday, matters intensified. A second tenant group announced intentions to form a collective association to address long-standing issues in Davenport-managed buildings, supported by pro bono legal counsel who had recently taken an interest in housing equity. A civic organization publicly condemned discriminatory retail confrontations, referencing the Madison Avenue incident without naming the women involved, but identifying Davenport by name after confirming his presence through multiple witnesses. By midday, a second bank indicated that additional collateral might be required to secure ongoing financing. The pattern was unmistakable. Confidence was eroding. Davenport reportedly spent Tuesday afternoon demanding explanations from partners and insisting the controversy would blow over. But the optics of a wealthy developer berating black women in a luxury boutique, at a time when the national climate was shifting, proved difficult to dismiss. None of the pressures applied were illegal. None involved physical intimidation. Every action was defensible on its own merits. Yet together they formed a tightening vice. By Wednesday morning, Davenport's primary development partner formally requested reassessment of their joint venture agreement, citing potential instability. A second newspaper ran a short column summarizing allegations of discriminatory housing practices connected to his portfolio. Invitations to two upcoming social functions were quietly rescinded. Around 2:30 p.m. Wednesday, Davenport received a visit from an attorney representing Harlem business interests, who explained in measured tones that the recent sequence of events was not random, but a response to his conduct on May 24th. The attorney outlined no threats, offered no negotiation, simply clarified that actions carry consequences in that respect, once violated publicly, could be defended through entirely lawful means. According to a source later familiar with the meeting, Davenport asked if there was anything he could do to halt the unraveling. The reply was succinct. The lesson is already in motion. By the close of business Wednesday, Davenport's empire had not yet collapsed, but it was trembling, financing under review, partnerships strained, tenants organized, and his name circulating through Manhattan's business corridors in tones of caution rather than admiration. And though no document bore his signature and no statement linked him directly to the unfolding crisis, those attuned to the undercurrents of New York understood that when the family of Bumpy Johnson had been humiliated, the response would not be loud or reckless. It would be deliberate, strategic, and impossible to ignore. By the time Saturday, May 31st, 1958 arrived, exactly 1 week after the confrontation on Madison Avenue, Charles Davenport III understood that his empire was no longer merely under pressure, but actively unraveling, and the final act of the lesson he had triggered was about to unfold in full public view. Throughout Thursday and Friday, the strain intensified. One bank formally exercised a clause requiring accelerated repayment on a portion of his development financing, citing increased risk exposure, while a second institution froze approval on a pending construction loan essential to a midtown project already behind schedule. Two partners demanded either additional guarantees or dissolution of their agreements. Tenant associations in 3 buildings announced coordinated escrow actions until Documented maintenance violations were addressed, and a respected civic coalition publicly called for an inquiry into discriminatory leasing practices tied to Davenport's portfolio. The newspapers, careful but firm, framed the story not as rumor but as pattern. An influential developer whose public conduct aligned with long-standing complaints about exclusion. Invitations to private dinners vanished. A country club board placed his membership under review pending investigation into conduct unbecoming. Davenport, who only days earlier had barked at clerks and customers with absolute confidence, now moved through his midtown office pale and sleepless, demanding reassurances no one could credibly give. At 1:40 p.m. that Saturday afternoon, while Davenport remained sequestered in meetings with attorneys, Lillian and Evelyn Carter stepped once again onto Madison Avenue and approached Harrington and Blythe. They arrived not defiantly but calmly, dressed with the same understated elegance as the week before. Lillian in a pale gray suit this time, Evelyn in a soft lavender dress with white gloves, accompanied discreetly by counsel and observed from a respectful distance by several community representatives who had come simply to ensure that dignity would not again be challenged. The store manager stood waiting at the entrance. According to witnesses, he greeted them by name, apologized directly for the previous Saturday's events, and informed them that Charles Davenport III was no longer welcome on the premises. Inside, 3 senior sales associates attended to them with attentive professionalism, presenting the finest selections from the summer collection, offering tailoring consultations and refreshments, and ensuring their comfort at every turn. Customers who had witnessed the earlier humiliation appeared markedly different now. Several nodded politely. One woman introduced herself and expressed regret for not intervening, and the atmosphere, once tense and silent, felt almost ceremonially respectful. For 90 minutes, Lillian and Evelyn examined gowns, discussed alterations, and selected 2 evening dresses along with accessories, their purchases wrapped carefully in tissue and boxed with care. Outside, no protests erupted, no speeches were made. The power of the moment lay precisely in its normalcy. They exited the boutique as customers, valued, acknowledged, served. Meanwhile, across town, Davenport received confirmation that his principal lender would not extend further accommodation without immediate capital infusion. By Monday, forced asset sales were under negotiation. Over the following weeks, the consequences compounded. Properties were liquidated at discounts to satisfy accelerated loan demands. Development plans stalled indefinitely. Partnerships dissolved. Tenants, now organized and legally advised, pressed successfully for improvements and equitable leasing oversight, and social circles that once welcomed Davenport's presence cooled into calculated distance. He attempted to attribute the cascade to coincidence, to market fluctuations, to political agitation, yet privately he understood the sequence had begun the moment he chose to humiliate 2 women in public. No formal document ever tied the unraveling directly to retaliation. No recorded statement bore confirmation. Yet within Manhattan's business community, the narrative hardened into cautionary certainty. Respect was not optional, and power no longer flowed in only one direction. In Harlem, the lesson resonated differently, not as vengeance, but as affirmation that dignity could be defended strategically, without spectacle or illegality, through economic and social leverage applied with intelligence. Lillian Carter never granted interviews about the incident. Evelyn spoke of it only once, telling a friend that the return to Harrington and Blythe mattered more than the collapse of any man's fortune. As for Bumpy Johnson, he declined all comment, issuing through his attorney a brief statement supporting equal treatment under the law and denying involvement in any businessman's private difficulties. But those who observed the city's shifting currents in 1958 recognized what had occurred. A single outburst, born of arrogance and prejudice, had collided with a new reality in which influence could be marshaled quietly and decisively. Charles Davenport III did not lose everything overnight, but he lost enough capital, alliances, reputation, to ensure that his name would be spoken thereafter not with admiration but with warning. And on a sunlit Saturday afternoon, when 2 women walked calmly out of a Madison Avenue boutique treated with the courtesy they had always deserved, New York understood that something fundamental had changed. Humiliation would no longer pass unanswered, and the cost of disrespect could exceed even a millionaire's imagination.